not through power, but through spirit. These words perfectly capture the essence of our next honored guest and speaker.
She's a prominent author, activist, and public intellectual known for her outspoken views on Islam and women's rights.
She is a best-selling author of influential works, including Infidel, Nomad, Heretic, that chronicle her extraordinary life journey and challenge conventional thinking.
She's a former Dutch parliamentarian who has established herself as a fearless advocate for women's rights globally, particularly those oppressed under fundamentalist interpretations of religion.
She's a distinguished fellow at prestigious institutions, including the Hoover Institution at Stanford University and Harvard Kennedy School's Future of Democracy Project.
She's a woman of profound intellectual courage whose personal journey embodies resilience, transformation, and an unwavering commitment to truth regardless of personal cost.
From her childhood in Somalia, she has become a global voice for human dignity, for human rights, for faith, for freedom, and she is here with us tonight.
She's really amazing. Please welcome to the stage, Mrs. Ayaan Hirsi Ali.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me start with two small stories since I came here. The first one was at midnight on Tuesday, when coming from the airport to my hotel, I noticed a woman walking alone on the streets. And then farther along a few minutes later, another woman. And then later a third. And I remarked on it and I said, there are women walking alone on the streets? It's nearly midnight. And the driver said, in Israel, women can walk on the streets at any time of day or night. The second anecdote, this afternoon, I was at my hotel when one of the staff members came and said, get up, we're going to the shelter, because the red alert sirens were going on. And sitting in the shelter, I started to think about this society that is willing to defend and to die even so that their women can walk safely on the streets. Congratulations to that. That's a superior culture. Ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure and a privilege to be in Israel for me today. And I want to thank you for giving me the opportunity to come here in person to express my admiration and my support for you, the citizens of Israel. It wasn't always like this with me. Growing up in Somalia and in Saudi Arabia in the 1970s, and as an Islamist teenager in Kenya in the 1980s, I was taught to hate you. I hated you because it was whispered into my dear little ear as a child. This isn't just an allusion to a line from an old musical condemning American racism. To hate the Jew is an act of worship for many, in fact, most Muslims, and in particular, for all Islamists. Remember, when Egypt's only truly democratically elected president, Mohamed Morsi, was caught on tape in 2010, urging his followers, I quote, to nurse our children and our grandchildren on hatred for Jews and for Zionists. Not long after this, he described Zionists as bloodsuckers who attack the Palestinians. He called them warmongers and descendants of apes and pigs. To my generation, Gen X, I'm 55 years old, Jew hatred was disseminated in person, at home, in school, on the radio and on television, on videos and in films and in the mosque, on social occasions like in weddings and funerals. It was mostly top-down. People who held positions of authority told us what to think and say and pray with regard to the Jew. You may recall this dialogue on Saudi television 8 years before Morsi's remarks, and it's translated from the Arabic by the Great Middle Eastern Media Research Institute. It's a dialogue between a 3-year-old and a television presenter. The presenter asks the child, "Do you like Jews?" The 3-year-old says, "No." "Why don't you like them?" "Because they're Jews and apes." "Who said this?" "Our God." "Where did he say this?" "In the Quran." The presenter responds approvingly. No parent, he says, could wish for Allah to give them a more believing girl than she. May Allah bless her, her father, and her mother. That's how it used to be in the third world of Arab and Muslim countries. The effort to condition children into hating Jews as part of their daily worship was a united campaign. It was perhaps the only thing most Muslims and their leaders agreed on. In Western societies, the campaigns to fight anti-Semitism that started right after the end of the Second World War were sustained, comprehensive, and very effective throughout the Cold War. My compliments go to the pioneers, the compilers, the curators, the funders, and the tireless activists who envisioned a world with no anti-Semitism. Their slogan was "Never Again," and it was hugely successful as this kind of open, all-consuming hatred of Jews disappeared from mainstream society in the West. Of course, it lived on in the fringes of the far right, the neo-Nazi, and white supremacist circles. However, on the issue of Jew hatred, things have changed in major ways. I'm going to describe 5 of them. First, due to the mass transformative migration to the West that has been underway for decades, the Islamist-driven anti-Semitism has become commonplace in Europe and even in the US. I'm invited to platforms to come and tell my story. 25 years ago, my story of growing up in Somalia, undergoing female genital mutilation, a forced marriage, and then fleeing to Europe and building a life in a small, homogeneous European country was astonishing or exceptional to the Western audiences who were shielded from the world I was born and raised in until my early 20s. But most of those audiences are no longer shielded from the third world. In some ways, now the West has become the third world. Some of the features of the third world, like the civic tension, like the exposure of women and children to harm and exploitation, like poverty, dislocation, whether voluntary or compelled, war or the threats of war, civil or foreign, are a growing concern in places like France, the United Kingdom, Germany, Sweden, Belgium, and others. Second, the internet and new technologies have made it a lot easier to propagate anti-Semitism. For the millennial and Gen Z generations, modern technology has given them the opportunity to be both passive consumers of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and Israelophobia, and active participants as content creators. They can generate fresh content all the time. The growing education levels of Muslims in the West has accelerated the hatred for Jews and for Israel in particular. The democratization of information has unleashed the creativity and the imagination of many Muslims to devote untold hours, often paid, of their time to advancing the most disgusting, false, libelous, and horrific lies about Jews and Israel. They dusted off copies of the Nazi and European literature on anti-Semitism and reimagined it for our time. Now, when the narrative of colonialism is considered the greatest sin of human history, Israel is accused of being the ultimate colonial project. Third, the global Islamist project to revive the caliphate that was abolished in 1924 is now headquartered in the West. After the so-called Arab Spring, when one after the other of autocratic Arab governments were toppled by popular uprisings, those Arab governments that survived the intended revolution understood the role Islamists played in inspiring and organizing the unrest. The Muslim Brotherhood in particular, often secretly working with the Iranian government, was rightly seen as the culprit. In response, the Muslim Brotherhood and all other Islamist groups and individuals suspected of insurrection were banned, imprisoned, defunded, and evicted by the Arab governments that either hosted them or tolerated them in the past. Many of those Islamists relocated to the West, where they found a warm welcome within the ranks of the existing Islamist bases. In Europe and in America, now we have extensive networks of mosques, Muslim schools, Islamic societies, public relations councils, student associations, law firms, political and policy networks run by Islamists, all working incrementally towards their stated goal of conquering the West through nonviolent means, and of course, in the process, defaming Israel, Zionism, and reviving the anti-Semitism we all thought was defeated. Fourth, the Islamists capitalized on the crisis of liberalism, and particularly the progressive end of the liberal spectrum. I recommend you read David L. Bernstein's book, Woke Antisemitism: How a Progressive Ideology Harms Jews. In America, the language of victimhood, developed by radical Marxists supposedly to expose the oppression of Black American descendants of slavery, concepts such as systemic oppression, intersectionality, and the binary division of society into oppressors and oppressed, was superimposed on American Jews. Jews are now white, privileged, Zionist, and supporters of an oppressor colonial state. Hamas, on the other end, in progressive circles, is a resistance movement bravely committed to fighting for the liberation of a beleaguered, colonized Palestinian people trapped in an open-air prison and subjected to systematic bombings in order to bring about their genocide. The Hamas rallies you saw on American and other Western campuses and cities in the spring of last year, dressed up as pro-Palestinian protests, are the culmination of more than 2, maybe even 3 decades of incubation and cultivation in education and media institutions in the West. Fifth and finally, I want to touch on the great realignment underway in the West. The political and ideological landscape that used to be based on class and religion on a spectrum from left-wing to right-wing has become meaningless. Today, the prevailing division is one between those perceived to be the elites, the ruling classes of the political, economic, urban, bureaucratic, and elites in the legacy media, versus the working and middle classes, the rural communities, those who attend churches or synagogues and get their information from alternative sources. In America, it's President Donald Trump and his MAGA movement that is now a coalition of former Democrats, white, working, middle, and rural classes, Hispanics, Blacks, and some women. The moderate Democrats are struggling to recapture their party from the progressives led by Bernie Sanders and a very colorful, crazy squad of women. In Europe, the establishment parties on both the center-left and the center-right have lost the credibility they once had. Voters are going in droves to the populist parties. Some of these parties, as in France and Belgium, had anti-Semitic elements in the past. This has changed as I see more and more Jewish voters either considering or openly voting and supporting these parties. Given these 5 elements of mass migration, the age of the internet, the headquartering of Islamism in the West, the crisis of liberalism, and the great realignment underway in the West, we must reassess the existing strategies for fighting anti-Semitism. Strategies that were successful in the past, but are now obsolete or worse, counterproductive. For example, those of us fighting anti-Semitism must take a positive part in the intense conversations underway in the West on the sanctity of national borders, national identity, patriotism, and taking pride in national heritage, traditions, and in national legacy. The old way of fighting anti-Semitism was focused on the ethno-nationalisms of the past that excluded, persecuted, and attempted to annihilate Jews. The emerging national consciousness of today is different. It's one that wants to be like Israel's, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, but not multicultural, and the applied philosophy that has hollowed out European and American institutions and rendered nationhood meaningless. I lived among the Dutch, and I have traveled extensively and repeatedly in Europe. I live in America, and I have traveled extensively and repeatedly in America. And I can tell you that the white populations there are not racist. They are being defamed as you are being defamed. They're not far right. They just want their societies and their way of life back. Here is a great opportunity to find new alliances and strengthen old ones. There are whole categories of citizens who are alienated in their own native countries. The white working and middle classes, women, homosexuals, Christians, and of course Jewish minorities who are beleaguered in these societies. We must consider new ways of fighting the menace of anti-Semitism. We must identify and prioritize the serious threats above the less considerable ones. In my view, the Islamist threat is the most compelling threat. It's multi-generational and it's multinational. It's state-driven and populist. It's theological, political, economical, social, and cultural. In other words, it's total and it's totalitarian. It has developed a well-oiled machine of propaganda that goes by the artificial name of Islamophobia, relying on 1/5 of humanity, exploiting and manipulating the far left, and even seeking and finding resonance on the right and the far right. Say what you will about Islamists, but they tell us repeatedly what's on their minds. We don't need to hire consultants and academics with a PhD on the mysterious, benign intentions of Hamas that we all overlook. We don't need to find super-duper professionals to lay out why ISIS is fond of filming the slitting of the throats of Christians, Alawites, and Muslims who refuse to join their cult, or why the Islamist government of Iran is squandering its GDP on developing a nuclear bomb to wipe Israel off the map. They tell us, and they don't tire of telling us. They shout it, and they punctuate those shouts with Allahu Akbar. They all have websites on which they spell out their intentions. They use every medium of print and broadcast to share their views. They post their objectives on YouTube and on X, formerly Twitter, and on TikTok. They tell us they want the caliphate back. To get there, they want to wipe Israel off the map. They want to destroy the Arab and Muslim governments of today, except, of course, Qatar and Turkey and the Taliban government that help them. They persecute and kill Christians. They shove women out of the public space. They rape, they mutilate, and they maim the infidels, including ex-Muslims and even devout Muslims who disagree with them. It's not only synagogues in Jewish cemeteries that they target. They also deface and destroy churches and the mosques of minorities, Hindu and Buddhist shrines. I want to conclude by saying that today a majority of humanity is threatened by radical Islam. We are, in fact, all Jews.